We're going to continue our study of the book of Acts today. And the title of this lesson is Paul Arrived at Rome. For weeks and weeks and weeks, Paul's been trying to get to Rome. And he finally makes it today. And we're going to see that God does some incredible things in this last leg of his journey that brings him to Rome. And so let's look at this. It starts in Acts chapter 28, verse number 14. Acts chapter 28, verse number 14. Guys, there's still a hum up here. I don't know what it is out there. And the last part of verse 14 says this. So we came to Rome. After all that he's been through, finally we get to the place where Luke writes that we came to Rome. Now, the last time we saw Paul, he had completed a 3-month layover on the island of Malta, and he was sailing on toward Rome. Luke had written about that in chapter 28, verse number 11. He wrote, after 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. Luke continued his narrative of Paul's journey to Rome by giving a brief itinerary of his travels. He wrote this in verse number 12. We put in at Syracuse, and we stayed there 3 days. Syracuse was the ancient capital of Sicily, and it was located about 80 miles north of Malta. And probably the reason for the 3-day layover at Syracuse was that the wind was blowing from the north, making sailing toward Rome very difficult. They were having to sail into the wind. And so they put in at Syracuse to wait for the wind to change. And then after 3 days, the captain of the ship, evidently short on patience, like some of us, decided to set sail even though the wind was still a hindrance. And Luke wrote about that in verse 13. From there we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. And because of the hindering wind, they were only able to sail the roughly 70 miles north to Rhegium, which was located on the southern tip of Italy. They're getting close to Rome now. They've actually made it to Italy, on the southern tip of Italy. And the following day, the wind changed, and they were able to sail north about 170 miles to a place called Puteoli on the western coast of Italy. Luke wrote about that in verse 13. The next day, the south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli. And then after a brief layover at Puteoli, Paul, Luke, and their escorts journeyed overland about 75 miles to Rome, making 2 stops along the way. The first one at a place called the Forum of Appius, and then the second one at a place called the 3 Taverns. And Luke wrote, after all of that, so we came to Rome. They finally made it. God finally did exactly what he said he was going to do. He said they were going to make it to Rome. They've made it to Rome. They've been through all kinds of stuff on the way. They've been through a shipwreck. They've been through a storm. They've been through soldiers wanting to kill them. They've been through a snake bite on the beach there at Malta. They've been through all kinds of things, but God finally did what God said he would do, and that is he brought Paul to Rome. I'm going to tell you the bottom line of this story is God's always going to do what he says he's going to do. He always is. It doesn't matter what's going on in your life. When you look at the scripture and you see what God says he's going to do for you, he's going to do for you regardless of what may happen in the meantime. And the devil may try to engineer all kinds of things to get you to believe that God's not going to bring you through, but God is always going to do what God says he's going to do. And so we need to understand that. God said he was going to bring Paul to Rome, and now Paul's arrived at Rome. When Paul and Luke, when they reached this place called Puteoli, the church there extended hospitality to them by providing lodging for them for an entire week. Hospitality by a church. This church and some people from that church invites them to stay with them for an entire week while they're there. Luke wrote about it in Acts chapter 28, verse number 14. He wrote, there we found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. Now these believers were simply doing what the author of the book of Hebrews instructed believers to do when he wrote this in Hebrews chapter 13, verse number 2. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Now, hospitality is serving others in ways that require you to open your home to them. That's what hospitality is. Now, we in America today, the generation that's about 50 years old and down, we're really not very good at hospitality. Did you ever notice that? We really don't want to open our homes to other people. We're maybe a little bit afraid to do that. Maybe we're a little bit embarrassed to do that. Whatever the reason, this American generation that we're living in now is not really good at hospitality. But what does the Scripture instruct us to do? It instructs us to show hospitality, both by example, and God gives us a command to do that. And these believers in the city of Puteoli open their homes to these traveling strangers and allow them to stay with them for an entire week. Now, they were probably in Puteoli for a week because the soldier who was in charge of these prisoners had to send ahead to Rome to announce to Caesar that they were going to be imminently arriving, that they were about to get to Rome so they could make accommodations to keep these prisoners somewhere in the city because the prisons were full. And we're going to see what the result of that is as we go further in the study. But they had to send notification ahead. And so they had to tarry there at Puteoli for a little while in time for a messenger to carry the message to Rome and then back again to tell them when the emperor says they'll have everything ready for you to arrive at Rome with these prisoners. And it's nothing short of amazing that God has arranged things that there's a hospitable church in Puteoli to provide lodging for his men and their escorts while they're waiting for permission to go on to Rome. Paul may have been reflecting back on this incident at Puteoli when he wrote to the church at Rome a little later. And this is what he wrote to them in Romans chapter 12, verse number 13. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. And then look, here's particularly how he wanted them to share with them. Practice hospitality. Practice hospitality. That's a command. That's not a suggestion. Share with the Lord's people who are in need and practice hospitality. Share with them whatever they need and then open your home to them when they're doing mission for the Lord. And that's what we find here. Paul may very well have been reflecting back on what happened at this little church in Puteoli when he was prompted by the Spirit of God to write that to the people of Rome. And listen, that's for us today too. We need to share hospitality to people, especially God's people who are on mission for Him. We need to share hospitality to them. And I want you to understand, if we as individuals are supposed to be hospitable to other people, then we as a church are supposed to be hospitable to other people. When people come into our church meetings, they ought to feel like that they're guests in our home. We ought to do everything we can to make them feel that they are extremely welcome here and that we want them here and that we want to provide for whatever they need while they're here. That ought to be our goal. And I think we work hard to do that. I hope you're aware that that's why we try to have greeters at the doors, and that's why we have this time of greeting to welcome people in. That's why we have the Connection Cafe to just offer to people hospitality when they come here. And we don't want anybody to feel like they don't belong here when they come here. We work hard at that. I'm so blessed when I hear people out through the week, they say, I never been to a church like that church. They really act like they want me there. They know where I've been and what I've done and where I've come from, and they still act like they love me anyway. I'm excited about that. I am thrilled about that. But then, there's another side to the coin. I don't want to embarrass this guy and tell you who he is, but a young man told me this morning when he got here, do you know that there are people who say you're a cult? A cult. I think the first time that's happened, is it, Kevin? People say that about us. Why would they say that about us? Because we are pretty radically different from your typical church, aren't we? Radically different. And the reason we're radically different is because we're trying to do what this says to do. Just show hospitality to people. Just welcome anybody. Just welcome anybody. And whenever a church begins to do that, and whenever a church says everybody that comes to our church doesn't have to be just like us, but that we're open to anybody that Jesus may want to save and change their lives and bring them into His kingdom. We don't care who they are or where they've been or what they've done or where they're headed. We want to help them to be headed toward Jesus, and we open our arms to them and welcome them. And when you do that, then the devil's not happy. And when the devil's not happy, he's going to use people to say things and do things that are derogatory and that are not complimentary. But didn't they do that to Jesus? They said He cast out demons by the prince of the demons, Beelzebub. They said all kinds of bad things about Him. He goes to eat with sinners, as if that were a bad thing. You know, they had all kinds of critical things to say about Jesus, and people are going to say critical things about you when you just open your heart and you want to do for everybody whatever Jesus wants you to do for them. And so we got to understand that. God may have arranged this week of hospitality for Paul and his traveling companions at Puteoli so that Julius, the Roman soldier in charge of these prisoners, would have time to notify Caesar's court that with its backlogged docket that their arrival would be imminent. And as I mentioned in an earlier lesson, by the time Paul arrived at Rome, Nero's prisons were so full of Christians who were accused of crimes against the empire that the governor was forced to allow, that Caesar was forced to allow many of them to secure private housing in which they were incarcerated under house arrest. And that was exactly what happened to Paul when he reached Rome. The prisons were so full, there was no room for him there. And so he secured a house and he stayed there under house arrest. Luke wrote about it in verse number 16 of chapter 28. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. Only one reason that they allowed Paul to live by himself in a rented house with a soldier to guard him is that the prisons were too full to put him there. It was a terrible, terrible time in the history of the church. So many Christians were accused of crimes against the Roman Empire and brought to Rome for trial, and many of them executed. The prisons were overflowing. But you see, God's timing is always impeccable. Had Paul reached Rome a few months earlier, before Nero's prisons were filled to capacity, he most likely would have been tried quickly and executed. Had he reached Rome a few months later, by the time Nero had executed multiple thousands of Christians and the prison population had decreased, Paul would most likely have been quickly tried and executed as well. He later referred to God's miraculous deliverance, God's timing of getting him there at a time when the courts were so backlogged and that many decisions that were not normal for the Roman Empire were handed down just to deal with this backlog of cases. He explained how God used all of that to deliver him from what would have been otherwise certain death. He referred to God's miraculous deliverance from Nero's court when he wrote this. He wrote it to Timothy, his young disciple, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. He wrote, "At my first defense," that's my first trial before Caesar, before Nero's court, "no one came to my support." There was no one there to stand up for me and try to help me. No one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. How lonely he must have felt. Everyone deserted him. May it not be held against them. So was he bitter and unforgiving? No, he's praying that God will forgive those who deserted him. But the Lord, here's the key, the Lord stood at my side and gave me strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and all of the Gentiles, those non-believing people, those non-Jews who were in service in Nero's court, so that all of them might hear it. God had an incredible way of showing Paul that his plan was being worked out. And what he says here is that as he works out his plan, that he's in control. Paul is in Nero's court. Paul has arrived there at exactly the time he needs him to be there. And in the course of all of this, he says that I was delivered from the lion's mouth. Now, this is a thinly veiled reference to Nero's deadly attacks on the Christians. Paul says God worked it all out so that I could be here and at the same time be delivered from the lion's mouth. So what we got here is we've got Paul understanding that God's in control of getting him to Rome at the time when he needs to be there. And here's the amazing thing about this whole deal. Paul understands that God has a purpose in all of this. Even though he's under arrest and he's at Rome and his life is in jeopardy, but God's going to deliver him from all of that because God has a purpose. And what's God's purpose? He wants the Gentiles who are serving in Nero's court to hear the message of the gospel. And I want you to understand this. God may take you through some very puzzling, confusing, uncertain, dangerous circumstances, but in all of that, God has a purpose. In all of that, God has a plan. And God's plan always involves getting more and more people exposed to the message of the gospel, because He wants as many people as possible to be able to get to heaven one day and spend eternity with Him. God is not as concerned about our security and about our comfort and about our safety as He is about the eternal well-being of men and women and boys and girls who need to know Jesus. Do you get that? And so Paul understood that. He understood that if God gets him locked up and under house arrest at Rome, and he understood that there's a dangerous madman at the head of the Roman Empire by the name of Nero that he calls the Lion here, that God can take care of Nero and deliver him from Nero and his court, and in the process, God can give him the opportunity to get the message to the maximum number of people. And isn't that what the life of the Christian ought to be all about? Getting the message out to the maximum number of people. And so he talks to Timothy about that. He gives his experience and his own testimony about what God is wanting to do in that situation, and it's to get the gospel to these Gentiles. They heard the message, so it's likely that the hospitality of the believers at Puteoli saved Paul's life, because it resulted in his arriving at Rome at just the right time to be delivered from the lion's mouth. We never know what God may do as a result of the hospitality we offer people. We never know how many lives might be changed, how many lives might be saved. We never know what supernatural things may occur if we're just obedient and extend hospitality to people as God leads us to do that. It's an incredible thing. You remember the story of Abraham, and this has already been mentioned here, that some people have entertained angels unaware. The story that's a reference to is in the Old Testament story of Abraham, when 3 men showed up one day. And Abraham is minding his own business, sitting in the tent, doing whatever Jewish men did in those days. And these 3 men showed up, and immediately he invites them to stay and to have a meal, and he provides for their needs, and he just extends hospitality to them. And it turns out that they weren't men at all, they were angels. And one of them was the angel of the Lord. One of them was the Lord Jesus Christ before He became flesh. They were on their way down to look over the situation at Sodom and Gomorrah, and God would bring His final verdict of judgment on those wicked cities. And they stopped at Abraham's place and got some hospitality along the way. And Abraham, without knowing it, entertained angels, just because he was doing what God wanted him to do by extending hospitality. Now, let's go ahead to the next section. I call this next section of this story the gift of encouragement. You see, the believers in the church at Rome had somehow learned that Paul and Luke were coming to Rome, and were almost there. Maybe they learned it from the messengers that were sent to notify Caesar's court that they were coming. We don't know exactly how they got this information, but they somehow learned that Paul and Luke were coming to Rome, and that they were down at the Forum of Appia or the 3 taverns, one of those 2 places, depending on how far their journey had progressed. And so they do something quite amazing, quite incredible. Luke wrote about it in Acts chapter 28, verse number 15. He wrote, "The brothers and sisters there," that is those in Rome, "had heard that we were coming," and we don't know how they heard, but it really doesn't matter. News gets out. "And they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us." You see, the 3 taverns was about 40 miles from Rome, and the Forum of Appius was about 35 miles from Rome. Either of those journeys would have been quite a time-consuming and inconvenient trip in the mid-1st century. I mean, they spent quite a bit of time and effort to make that journey out of Rome down to these 2 locations. Evidently, some of the groups stopped at one place, and the others traveled about 5 miles further to the other place, and these believers did that because they were people on a mission. These believers evidently had a mission in mind when they made these journeys, and their mission was accomplished. Luke described the result of their meeting with Paul out there on the outskirts of Rome, he wrote this: "At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged." Obviously, he was somewhat discouraged by this point in the journey. But when these Christians heard that he was coming, and they left Rome, and they journeyed south, some 35 miles, some 40 miles, and they met him on the way, he was encouraged. I think that's kind of incredible, something that's kind of heartwarming for us to see. You see, he was evidently discouraged. After all, he had recently endured a dangerous storm at sea, a shipwreck, an assassination plot, a potentially fatal snake bite. I mean, things from Earth's level were not pleasant for him. And then in characteristic fashion, when God's man needed encouragement, God provided it through the actions of fellow believers. I want you to understand something. Most of the time when somebody is discouraged and then they are encouraged, it is because of what God uses another human being to do for them. The question is, are you willing to think like that, make decisions like that, and put yourself in the position of being an instrument of encouragement in the hand of God? That's what these people did. They were willing to go out of their way to encourage these two Christian men who were en route to Rome. They traveled some 35 miles and some 40 miles to see him, to meet him before he got to the city, and had to face Nero's court and all that was ahead for him. And as a result of that, at the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. How many of you have ever been really discouraged? That's not a real good place to be, is it? And then the same ones of you who just responded and said, yes, I've been really discouraged. How many of you can look back and see that God used some person to encourage you? That's the way God works. And that's exactly what he did here. And it's incredible when God does that. He uses people to do that. One of the responsibilities of believers is to encourage other believers. The author of the book of Hebrews wrote about that. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. Let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. You know what it means to spur one another on? It means we are to be cheerleaders for one another. We are to motivate one another, to love others and to do good deeds for others, not giving up meeting together. He said you don't want to quit being together, because if you quit meeting together, if you quit coming together like we do here on Sunday mornings, then you lose the benefit of having your cheerleaders cheer for you. You lose the benefit of other people spurring you on, motivating you on to love and to good deeds. So he says, not giving up meeting together. I got to give you this now. This whole thing is about meeting together, Christians meeting together as the church. He says, don't give that up. Don't quit doing that. Okay? Don't quit doing that. And here's the deal. It's not that God needs you here. Please don't get that in your mind. God does not need you, and God does not need me. He wants us, but he doesn't need us. He's self-sufficient. God was doing fine before any of us ever came along. And when we're all dead and gone, God's still going to be doing fine. Do you understand that? He doesn't need us. He loves us and he wants us. He knows that us being together is not just good for him so that he can work through us to get done what he wants to get done. He knows it's good for us. It's good for us because we got a group of other people that is encouraging us and spurring us on to good works. That's when the church is doing what it's supposed to be doing. I got to tell you though, can I be perfectly honest with you? I've been in churches that wasn't the case. I've been in churches that if you have been on a journey through life that took you to some bad places and you made some bad choices and bad decisions and got you in bad trouble and got you a reputation and all that kind of thing, I've been in churches that wouldn't encourage you. In fact, they might look down their nose at you and be judgmental towards you and all that kind of stuff. But I want you to understand, when the church is healthy and it's functioning the way it's supposed to function, everybody who comes in the doors is a potential target for encouragement and for spurring one another on respond to love and to good deeds. And so what that means to us is every time we come to church, we need to come to church on a mission. And our mission needs to be to have our radar out to find somebody who needs a cheerleader, to find somebody who needs encouragement, to find somebody who needs a nudge, to go ahead and love regardless of what's happening in your life, and to go ahead and do good regardless of the obstacles and the temptations that are out there. We ought to come to church on that kind of mission. We ought to come to church with the effort of giving rather than the effort of just receiving. Do you understand that? And here's what I found to be true. The more you give, the more you receive. It's a wonderful cycle. So you get that? Everybody who comes ought to come on a mission. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, spur one another on to love and good deeds. Not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another. So you see, the church ought to be nothing more than a big support group. You know, secular counselors think that they engineered something wonderful in the last generation when they started support groups. Jesus started a support group 2,000 years ago, and he called it his church. And that's the way it ought to be. That's the way a healthy church would be like that. Every time we come to church, as I said, we should come on a mission, and the mission is giving the gift of encouragement to someone who needs it. Here's the conclusion. Today's lesson in the book of Acts concluded with a statement written by Luke that seems somewhat insignificant if you read it alone. This is what it is in verse number 16 of Acts chapter 28. When we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. You know, the prisons were full, and so they let him rent a house, and he was under house arrest, the soldier guarding him. I love people who are under house arrest, don't you? I know people who are under house arrest today. I don't know if anybody here today is under house arrest, but normally somebody is. Is that okay? Yeah. Paul was under house arrest, okay? I want you to understand that. And you know, we have this, what I think is a wonderful ministry to the folks who are at P&P. You know, probation and parole. You're aware of that. They're aware of that. We love them. We have this wonderful ministry. But can I tell you this? Can I tell you how that got started? Because we had a teenage boy in our church. He was 19 at the time. His name was Blake. Some of you remember Blake. His mama was Martha. Oh, Blake. Mama had been in all kinds of trouble, and she got her heart right. Jesus saved her, and she started coming to our church, and she's dragging them three boys along, and they did not want to be here. Am I telling the truth, those of you that were here? They did not want to be here, but she drug them along anyway. Things rocked along there, and she came to church for several months and brought those boys, and then she got in trouble again. And by this time, Blake was 19 years old, and he was in trouble. And so Blake was at P&P, and his mama was at the county jail. And she got sent away for 120. And so I went to see Blake when he was at the county jail before he went to P&P. And he was going to be at P&P, and so I just called up there and asked permission to bring him to church. Because for a while, at one point when he was in P&P, his mama would bring him. So I thought maybe they'll let me bring him. And I just called and said, can I bring Blake to church? And they said, yeah, you can do that. And that started our P&P ministry. Because Blake came. He finally got out of P&P, but he was under house arrest. And some of you remember this. Right here in this tub, we baptized old Blake with an ankle bracelet on. And when I baptized him, one of the elders had to hold his foot up out of the water because we couldn't get the ankle bracelet wet. Do you understand that? And so because somebody was under house arrest, and because of our love for that person, and willing to include that person and point him to Jesus one step at a time, we have 9 or 10 people here today. We've had as many as 20 people in one service from P&P, and lives have been changed. Do you get that? Do you understand that? And so That's what I'm talking about here is God never wastes a circumstance. He never wastes any kind of situation that we find ourselves in. We can always leverage that for His glory and be a blessing to people, whatever circumstance they're in. And so here Paul is under house arrest. And if you read that by itself, it doesn't seem all that incredible. But when you read it along with a verse from the final section of Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, it takes on a whole new meaning. This is what he wrote. He wrote this while he was under house arrest. This is one of the prison letters that he wrote from that rented house with the soldier guarding him. This is what he wrote. All God's people here send you greetings. So God has some people in Rome. Some of them have traveled down there to the Forum of Appium and the Three Taverns to see him, to welcome him to Rome. But all of God's people here send you greetings. But the next phrase is incredible. Especially those who belong to Caesar's household. I want you to get this. The Caesar at the time was Nero. Nero was a raging madman. Evil personified. Killed Christians by the multiple thousands. Had them sentenced to death and executed them. Some of them didn't even go through the court system. He just burned them at the stake to provide light for his garden parties. He was an evil, evil man. And he was going to eradicate Christianity from the Roman Empire. He was going to stamp out the Christian movement from the empire. But you can't stop Christianity. Because there are believers. Where? In Caesar's household. Let me tell you how that most likely happened. Here's how that most likely happened. The soldiers who guarded Paul during that round-the-clock rotating shift of soldiers were part of the imperial regiment who were housed in Caesar's palace and therefore belonged to Caesar's household. Now imagine being a Roman soldier chained to Paul for an 8 to 12-hour shift, day after day, week after week, month after month. What do you think these soldiers heard Paul talk about again and again and again? Well, here's a clue. Here's a clue from Luke. This is what he described in verses 30 and 31. For 2 whole years, Paul stayed there in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So guess what happens to these Roman soldiers who were chained to him for 8 to 12 hours a day? They're hearing Paul talk about Jesus. Paul's having guests come in, and they're all talking about Jesus. And there's Jesus, 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 and more Jesus. And when you give people enough Jesus, you know what happens eventually? They believe in Jesus. And that's what's happened to these soldiers. They have started believing in Jesus, and they're living in Caesar's household. And that's why Paul wrote, all of God's people here send you greetings, but especially, and I think he chuckled when he wrote this, especially those who belong to Caesar's household. I want you to get that. Those soldiers in the imperial regiment who heard Paul's witness became believers, and as a result, the good news infiltrated Caesar's household. Here's what I see in that. The good news is unstoppable. You can't stop it. I'm going to tell you a personal story about that. Along about this time, if Miss Jenny was sitting where you are, John, she'd be going, because she'd be wanting me to hurry up and get this over with. But I got to tell you this. When I was growing up, I grew up in a hellhole. I don't know how many of you know that, but I grew up in a really bad environment. My mom had not been saved yet. My dad was just kind of a neurotic, psychotic kind of guy. I don't know what had happened to him through his lifetime, but he hated God and anything that had to do with God. He hated the church. He hated Christians. We never went to church. He wouldn't let us go to church. It was just a dark, dark, dark environment to grow up in. I got saved. God came in under the radar, and through a friend of mine, I was invited to a revival meeting, and then after that, I went to a skating outing with the youth group of that church, and the gospel was presented, and I got under conviction, and I received Jesus. I got saved that night. The people of that wonderful little church did not know what kind of an environment I was growing up in. And so the pastor told me to do what every good pastor would tell somebody to do. I mean, some kid gets saved. What do you tell them? Go home and tell your mom and dad what happened. So that's what he told me to do. So I thought, well, that's what I'll do. I went home, and when I got home at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I told my dad, I said, I got saved tonight. And he said, what? And I said, I got saved tonight. I believed in Jesus. And he slapped me and sent me to bed. I don't ever want to hear anything else about that, he said. From there, things went downhill. It really got bad. He wouldn't let me go to church, and all this stuff, and I didn't have a Bible, and so one of the Christians from the church gave me a Bible. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to have a Bible at my house. It had never come up before. But I brought that Bible in, and when he found out I had a Bible, he destroyed the Bible. But here's the point of the story. Here's the point of the story. About a half a dozen Bibles he destroyed. He would tear up a Bible, and within a week, somebody else would give me a Bible. He would find that one, he would tear the Bible up, and within a week, somebody else would give me a Bible. He would get rid of that one. It would just disappear. I wouldn't know where it went, but I knew he had done something with it. Somebody else would give me a Bible. 6 Bibles. And you know what that taught me? And finally, I don't know what happened, but he finally gave up. When he found the 6th Bible, the 7th one actually, because he destroyed 6 of them, the 7th Bible, and he finally gave up. And he just had a little cussing fit, and he finally gave up. If you want to read that trash, you can, he said. I still got that Bible. You cannot stop the good news. Do you understand that? Nero didn't want the good news in his palace, but God got it in there anyway. You cannot stop the good news. That's the incredible kind of God that we serve. And here's what I want to close with. May God teach us to be as consistent and effective in our witness for Jesus as Paul was. These Roman soldiers in Caesar's imperial regiment were the hardest of the hard. And they heard Paul talk about Jesus over and over again. Many of them became believers right there in Caesar's household. May God use us to do the same thing.